60% of Americans can't afford a minimal quality of life. Now, that's a shocking statistic, and it's according to the Ludwig Institute for Shared Economic Prosperity, an organization that tracks how much it actually costs to live in the US. Now, we're not talking living luxuriously, we're talking just covering basic needs like food, housing, healthcare, transportation, and childcare. This stat completely contradicts what we're told about the US economy. I mean, if you follow any sort of mainstream media coverage, you've probably heard that unemployment is near historic lows, inflation is cooling, slowly but surely getting closer to the Federal Reserve's target rate of 2% a year, and the major stock market indexes are still hovering near all-time highs. In other words, the economy on paper looks pretty good. And sure, there are some cracks forming, and I've been quick to point them out. First quarter GDP went negative, consumer sentiment has dropped quite a bit, but if you're just looking at headline numbers, you never guess that most Americans are struggling to afford basic survival. That disconnect is really what this video is about. Now, quick disclaimer, yes, the Ludwig Institute obviously collects and analyzes data differently than the US government. I'll touch on some of those differences, but this video isn't really about methodology. It's about why the government's version of economic success doesn't match most Americans' reality, at least according to this recent study. If you want to go deeper on this matter, I've linked the sources in the description. Now let's start with the big one, cost of living. The government said inflation was 4.1% in 2023. But according to the Ludwig Institute, the actual cost of basic necessities, things you can't cut from your budget, well, that rose 9.4%. That's more than double what CPI says. Now, to quote Ludwig, they said the stark contrast between official inflation figures and the lived experiences of most Americans highlight a fundamental disconnect. While the CPI provides a snapshot of price stability, to interpret it as reflective of what the average American household is experiencing is beyond misleading. According to Ludwig, it's the essentials that are draining people's wallets. Housing costs surged by 11.4% year over year in 2023, marking the largest annual increase on record. Now, most people know mortgage rates are 6 or 7%. Housing prices are at all-time highs or very close to them. The median cost of a home in the US is around $450,000. And if most people don't have $1,000 laying around for an emergency expense, how in the world can they afford a home? But this huge increase in housing costs isn't on its own. Transportation expenses, well, those rose by 14.7%, largely driven by higher insurance premiums and financing costs, despite a decrease in gas prices. Health insurance premiums increased by 7.9%, adding to the financial strain on households. And food prices went up by almost 4.5%, impacting the daily living costs for every American. These escalating costs contribute to a broader issue. But since 2001, the TLC has risen by 97.4%, while CPI has increased by a little over 72%, indicating that essential living costs have outpaced general inflation for a while. Now, in 2023, in terms of income, the bottom 60% of households earn just 22.1% of all disposable income. But they would need to earn 39% to meet the minimum quality of life standard. Now, they define this minimum quality of life standard at different levels for different family sizes. Just as an example, for a single person with no kids, they claim you need to make a little over $44,500 a year. But for couples with 3 kids, that couple would need to make over $130,000 a year. They also said, quote, Americans are working harder than ever, fueling our economic growth, but the benefits of that hard work is not being distributed in a way that supports upward mobility for too many middle and low income Americans. Now, this disparity highlights that even with employment, many Americans struggle to afford basic necessities, reflecting systemic issues in income distribution and cost of living assessments. So let's talk about unemployment, because this low unemployment number that we've been continuing to hear has constantly surprised me. Anecdotally, I know plenty of people who are out there searching for a job, and I also know many people who have a job but aren't making ends meet. So I think this is one of the most misleading stats in the whole system. You've probably heard that the unemployment rate has been around historic lows, which sounds great, and it implies that almost everyone who wants a job has one. But that number doesn't tell you a few things. First, it only counts people who are actively looking for work. Let's say you gave up searching, well, you're not in that stat. But probably more crazy is that if you're working just 1 hour a week, you're counted as employed. People who are working 2 part-time jobs that barely cover rent, well, those also count as still being employed. Now, compare that to the number from the Ludwig Institute. Their true rate of employment includes people working full-time in poverty wage jobs, people who are underemployed, meaning they're working fewer hours than they want or need, which many large corporations love to give workers less hours than they need or want, but also includes people who have stopped looking but still want work. Well, their number for the true rate of unemployment was almost 24.5% in 2023. That's 1 in 4 Americans who are either unemployed or stuck in a job that doesn't pay them enough to live. This is a massive credibility gap, and it matters because policymakers, news outlets, and voters make decisions based on that 4% number, not the 24% reality that Ludwig is claiming. It's the same pattern. The government's version of economic health leaves out the actual conditions people are living through. And I think this was a huge problem in the election. The economy was by and far the number one issue for voters. And a lot of people could point to a strong economy, at least on paper. But many Americans didn't actually feel like the economy was working for them. And that's where this disconnect is. Now, wage numbers also follow a similar script. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says average hourly earnings went up by 4.1% in 2023. But the Ludwig Institute found that for the bottom 60% of workers, real wages have been flat or declining since 2001, once you factor in the actual cost of living. In other words, wages are rising on paper until you try to spend them. Meanwhile, the labor force participation rate, the percentage of working age adults either employed or actively looking, is still lower than it was pre-2008. Many of those who left the workforce did so not by choice, but because the math of modern work just doesn't work for them anymore. So while cable news might be telling you the economy is still strong, tens of millions of people are stuck in jobs that don't pay enough to survive or are essentially shut out entirely. And that gap between the official story and the actual one, well, it's a policy disaster. Because if the people in charge don't really see the problem, or better yet, don't really want to acknowledge it, they're obviously never going to fix it. So how can the government report low unemployment, rising wages, and cooling inflation while nearly 2/3 of Americans can't afford a minimum quality of life? They're not measuring what really matters. At least not in the most effective way. If we look at inflation, like the CPI, this tracks the prices of a basket of goods and services. But there are 2 big problems, I think, with how it's used. First is it averages everything. So if TVs get cheaper, but rent and healthcare spike, those savings can end up diluting the pain. And obviously, if you don't need a new TV, then this is rather meaningless to you. But the other 2, housing or healthcare, necessities, well, you definitely feel that price increase. But second is it underweights the essentials. Housing is a prime example. The CPI doesn't use actual rent prices for most people. It uses something called owner's equivalent rent, which is basically a survey asking homeowners what they think they'd charge in rent. It's not only often disconnected, but it can be months behind real market shifts. Now, if we compare that to Ludwig's True Living Cost Index, well, this focuses on what people have to buy: rent, food, healthcare, transportation, childcare, a phone, internet, and personal care items. And so when you get a huge discrepancy between this True Living Cost Index and CPI, that gap can explain a lot because policymakers obviously are looking at CPI and they can think that the crisis is over. And if they were to look at Ludwig's data, it would be clear that the crisis never left and in fact is probably getting worse. Now, there's also a flaw in how they track wages. The government looks at averages. Ludwig corrects for that by breaking things down by income group, and the result can be quite damning. For most Americans, real wages have not kept up with the actual cost of living for over 20 years. Now, I want to be clear, there are solutions to this problem, and although it is a huge problem and it's only increasing, I thought in the spirit of not making an entirely depressing video, I would talk about a few of them. Obviously, none of these are easy. Some are also politically toxic, and others are definitely complex. But that doesn't mean they're impossible. It just means they really haven't been prioritized or taken very seriously. Let's start with probably the most important one that I don't think a politician can really avoid talking about anymore: taxing the rich. And we're not talking about some abstract moral crusade. We have to talk math. But before I do, this is the chairman of market and investment strategy for JP Morgan, when he was asked in response to a question about the growing inequality in America and how the government is going to handle just some of the national debt in the future.
We just saw this report where the top 19 households in America now own 1.8% of all US household wealth. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% own 3%. And that 1.8% number is up from around, I think it was 0.1% in 1980. In other words, does the level of wealth inequality in America concern you?
It concerns me for a number of reasons. First of all, it's terrible for society. It's led to massive increased political polarization to the point where the country can't get things done. The percentage of moderates in the House and the Senate are they're at the lowest levels in over 100 years. Some of the priors that have led the administration to pursue certain policies are very clear. When China was allowed into the World Trade Organization in 2001, it was a fantastic boon for profits, a boon for consumers in terms of low prices, but a disaster for manufacturing communities. Industrial production has basically flatlined since that date. So there are important discussions that have to be had about everything from tariffs to domestic investment to subsidies to marginal tax rates. If you believe that 30 years of globalization left too many people behind, you'd need the kind of superstar A-team of policymakers to figure out how to unwind parts of it with a scalpel, focus the benefits on the people who need them while not wrecking the capital markets in the process. And the jury's out whether or not this administration is comprised of people with those kinds of skills and vision and competence.
Is it?
But I'm very concerned about some of those wealth inequality issues. And, at the dam will break at some point and we will have a wealth tax in the United States. It's just a question of the level that it will be set at.
Now, of course, if you want to reduce the burden on working class Americans without exploding the national debt, the money obviously has to come from somewhere. And right now, the ultra wealthy aren't just rich, they're also taxed at lower levels. And no, I'm not talking about income tax. The wealthy make most of their money from alternative methods beyond just income. The top 1% of households hold more wealth than the entire middle class combined, yet many of them pay lower effective tax rates than nurses, teachers, or police officers, thanks to capital gains loopholes, offshore accounts, and stock-based compensation. Some economists have proposed a modest wealth tax, just 1 to 3% annually on net worth over $50 million. This is according to research by Berkeley economists. They concluded that this could generate up to $3 trillion over a decade. I think that could help the social safety nets for everyday Americans and start to bring the national debt under control over time. And this is just one or two potential solutions. I'm not saying it fixes everything, but most policies that try to get anywhere on this matter end up just being blocked. Not because they don't work, but because they would shift power. And that's the real reason things haven't changed. Because fixing this whole thing would require confronting who the current system actually works for. Now, I don't think that these are radical ideas. I think that implementing practical measures to seriously tackle some of these problems is what we're going to need in the future. But that would mean telling the truth about how broken the system really is. And that's the one thing our economy still can't afford to do. Now, if you want to learn more about wealth inequality in America, which I view as one of the biggest problems our country faces today, well, I covered it in this video here. Be sure to check it out next. Thanks for watching.